What if I told you the richest empire on earth didn't fall to guns or armies, but to a single financial mistake made by a family of Indian bankers? What if Britain, the empire that ruled half the world, wasn't built on British ingenuity alone, but on stolen Indian gold, manipulated rulers, and the betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect Bengal's wealth? A betrayal so powerful that it handed India, the wealthiest nation of the 1700s, to a trading company in just 3 hours. A coup financed not with soldiers, but with gold. A conspiracy that recruited 1.5 million Indian soldiers, drained $45 trillion of wealth, funded Britain's industrial revolution, and eventually bankrupted the very empire that carried it out. This is the story you were never told. The story of the Jagat Seths, the men who sold an empire without realizing they sold their own future. In the 1700s, India was not chaos. It was cash flow incarnate. Its fertile plains produced more revenue than the British Isles combined. Its ports overflowed with silk, muslin, spices, and jewels. Its cities thrummed with trade, wealth, and opportunity. At the heart of this empire of gold stood a family whose name was whispered with fear and respect. Jagat Seths, the bankers of the world. They weren't kings, they weren't conquerors, but they were more powerful than either. They controlled currency exchange, they financed armies, they stabilized trade routes. They issued bills of credit centuries before Europe even dreamed of central banks. The Mughal prince needed soldiers. He went to the Seths. A rebellious governor wanted loyalty in court. He went to the Seths. A merchant needed credit to ship goods across oceans. He went to the Seths. They were the invisible hand behind the throne. And empires bend when finance speaks louder than politics. By the 1730s, the Mughal Empire was dying. Bengal's Nawabs ruled as kings in all but name. Yet the Jagat Seths were the true power behind the throne. Their vaults contained more silver and gold than the East India Company could imagine. Every political decision, every military campaign, every rebellion moved through their ledgers. They were not simply merchants, they were kingmakers. But wealth breeds enemies, and ambition breeds betrayal. Across the seas, in London, the British East India Company had grown tired of trade. They wanted land, taxes, and power, and they were willing to use any means to get it. By 1757, the stage was set in Muradabad, Bengal's glittering capital. Siraj ud-Daulah, the Nawab, was impulsive, reckless, and dangerously independent. He ignored merchant advice, seized private property, and threatened the financial system that sustained Bengal's wealth. To the Seths, British rule didn't look like an invasion. It looked like order, profit, and opportunity. So, in secret, they struck a deal with Robert Clive. They would finance the company's army. They would bribe generals and officers. They would ensure defections at the critical moment. In exchange, they expected security, influence, and access to the treasury. They weren't starting a war. They were orchestrating a financial coup, June 23, 1757. The British East India Company faced Siraj's forces on the fields of Plassey. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. Siraj's generals froze, some refused to fight. The bribes worked perfectly. By sunset, Siraj was captured. Within days, he was executed. The British took control of Bengal, and the Jagat Seths? They thought they had secured their legacy, but they had misjudged the ambitions of their new partners. Bengal's wealth, once circulated within India, now flowed solely to London. The East India Company collected taxes, controlled credit networks, issued currency, absorbed trade routes. This was not a conquest by sword alone. It was the world's first corporate takeover. The Jagat Seths, the men who had orchestrated the fall of a Nawab, found themselves subordinate to their former protégés. The empire of private finance that once ran Bengal's economy was now under British control. From 1757 to 1857, Britain extracted what would equal $45 trillion today. Indian taxes funded British factories. Indian cotton powered Manchester's mills. Indian soldiers fought European wars. Revenue financed the Royal Navy and Britain's global campaigns. The Industrial Revolution didn't just happen. It was built on Bengal's prosperity. Every cannon forged, every ship launched, every textile sold to India, financed by Indian gold and labor. And yet history textbooks barely mention it. Britain didn't just take wealth. They took manpower. 1.5 million Indian soldiers were recruited for foreign wars they were promised land, money, or freedom for. Thousands died, millions labored. Few received recompense, some tried to rebel. They were crushed. Others tried diplomacy, they failed. The British Empire was built on Indian money and Indian blood. What became of the Jagat Seths? The British turned on them. They seized their assets, forced audits, and staged bankruptcies. Political persecution ended their dynasty. By the 1770s, the family that once controlled more wealth than the Bank of England had vanished from power. The bankers who financed the fall of the Mughals had now bankrolled their own downfall. The East India Company had learned an essential lesson: money is more powerful than armies. They perfected the financial system India had invented centuries earlier: credit networks, banking systems, trade control, tax collection, and they used it to expand their empire globally. Bengal's prosperity powered Britain's industrialization, wars, and naval dominance, a self-feeding cycle that extracted wealth for decades. By the mid-1800s, the East India Company collapsed from corruption and greed. The British Crown took control. India's private financiers were gone. Bengal's wealth was flowing into London. British empires began to stagnate without India's surpluses. By 1947, Britain itself was drowning in debt, more than 200% of GDP. The same trap that destroyed the Mughals centuries earlier had claimed the empire that had conquered the world. Empires rise and fall not on armies alone, but on who controls the money. India invented a system of trade, credit, and finance that could have rivaled Europe. But political missteps, betrayal, and colonial exploitation turned that genius into a tool for others' power. The Jagat Seths legacy lives on not in gold, not in palaces, but in the very blueprint of global finance. History isn't written by swords. It's written by ledgers. India funded its conquerors. Indian soldiers fought their wars. Indian wealth built factories that fueled Europe's industrial revolution. And yet, centuries later, most of the world never learned this truth. The richest empire the world had ever known was sold. Not by invaders, not by war, but by the silent power of money. And history repeated itself. Empires that forget who controls the gold are destined to fall.